Entrando em contato com o atendimento ao cliente... Para muitas pessoas é um jeito fácil de arruinar um bom dia. Mas na Zendesk, nós deixamos a experiência do cliente melhor. Melhor para sua avó, melhor para o seu vendedor preferido de flores, melhor para o cara do apartamento 3A, melhor para você, melhor para todos. Porque enquanto alguns dizem que o cliente sempre tem razão, nós dizemos que o cliente é sempre humano. E, como seres humanos, queremos fazer algo melhor para todos nós. Zendesk, experiência do cliente com IA desenvolvida para humanos.
Você que está ouvindo o seu podcast e curte fazer um bom negócio, vai aí uma dica imperdível. A nova Chevrolet S10 está na sua melhor versão, bruta e macia ao mesmo tempo. De um lado, toda a força e potência de uma picape bruta, invocada e conectada. Do outro, todo o conforto que só a nova suspensão proporciona, muito mais macia e silenciosa, deixando suas viagens ainda mais confortáveis. É a nova S10 que você conhece e confia, ainda mais bruta, brutalmente macia. Acesse chevrolet.com.br para saber mais.
Hello and welcome to The Price of Music, the show that looks at the money behind the music industry with me, Steve Lamack, and Music Ally's Head of Insight, Stuart Dredge. How are you, Stuart?
I'm very good. Very good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm not too bad. I've got a question for you.
Okay.
Have you ever lost anything at a gig? Have you misplaced, I don't know, left behind a sweater, lost your glasses? Ever left anything behind at a gig?
I must have done, yeah. I've never, nothing like major, nothing like a phone or a wallet, but I think I might have bought a t-shirt once and then left it on the floor. So like a donation to the band, and I never got to wear it. But yeah, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I can't remember, again, like yourself, I can't remember anything major which I've left. I think I've left my bag behind, and a friend of mine definitely left his coat in the lost property, not in the lost property, in the in the cloakroom. Just forgot he had gone to the gig with a coat. But the reason I mention this, because obviously you understand, I mean, the idea that venues will have lost property offices for things that fans have left behind, that seems very obvious to me. What I hadn't thought about, though, is that venues also have a lost property office for things that bands have left behind. I was at a gig the other Friday night at a venue in London, not a big venue, what you'd call a grassroots venue, and I sat outside between the bands having a chat with the promoter and a guy who was sat next to him who's in a band, who's a musician. And he was talking about this particular bit of musical kit. I can't remember exactly what it was. It wasn't an effects pedal, but it was something like that. And it was reasonably expensive, but the sort of thing you'd use to, write songs, particularly if you were into electronica. I think it might have been something to do, some sort of looping device. But anyway, it's quite an expensive bit of kit. And he said he'd started working on this new music using this equipment. And I said, was that expensive? And he said, no, we had one in lost property. And it turns out they have a lost property cupboard for, as I say, equipment which bands leave behind. And obviously some bands are a bit disorganised or drunk come the end of a set, and you imagine they might leave the odd cable behind. But they were saying, no, that people have left some really expensive stuff over here, down here over the years, and quite a lot of it goes unclaimed. So the venue tries to track down the artists, the musicians involved, but then if they can't find them, and if no one shows any interest, if they aren't claimed, they just start borrowing it. But apparently there's loads, I say, and quite expensive stuff that bands have just seem to have lost. Miss Super Fuzz pedal and never gone back for it.
I used to go to the front and try and get the set list. I should have been trying to get the pedals when I went to those gigs.
Some of them wouldn't have noticed. Yeah. There was even the guy was saying that one after one gig, he said, we've even have someone who's left a guitar behind. And the guitar was there for ages until eventually they managed to track down the guy who owned the guitar, and they phoned him up. And the guy said, no, I'm done with music after that gig. You can keep it. You can keep it. So, I mean, who can afford to just write off expensive bits of equipment. But anyway, if you do happen to work at a venue of whatever size, what's been left behind in lost property? Because I mean, if small venues have got an array of stuff, imagine what some of the big stadiums end up with.
Yeah. Well, often because a lot of bands come off stage, don't they? Especially at a big gig, and you kind of come off stage and you head straight to the car to go to your hotel. And you don't maybe go back to the changing room and clean up after yourself.
No.
So if you haven't got anyone to do that for you, which I guess when you get to a certain level, you have someone who's like, yeah, check what they've left, bring it all to the hotel.
Imagine the day after Coldplay. Boss, they've left behind a couple of Marshall stacks of drum riser and a couple of unused pyros. What are we going to do with these?
And the drummer's left there. Pick him up quick.
Put them in lost property. You can get in touch with us. You can email us if you have anything to share on this at thepriceofmusicpodcast at gmail.com. Right, news for this week. Shall we start with this about the 1975? The 1975 are being sued for $2.4 million by Malaysia's Good Vibes Festival.
Yeah, this has been running for a little while, actually. So this started in July last year when the 1975 played this festival in Malaysia. And I think, well, you might have seen it on the news, mightn't you? That Matty, the front man, he gave a speech about how he thought it was a mistake for them to play because of the kind of some of the censorship and the restrictions on the performances. Particularly around the fact that I think homosexuality is illegal in Malaysia. So any kind of, you can't have men kissing on stage and all these no-nos that are kind of explained to people. So he gave this speech and he said, I don't see the point of inviting us to a country and then telling us who we can have sex with. I believe they didn't play some of their songs because of the restrictions as well. And he said that on stage. And then he kissed Ross, the bass player. And a few minutes later, they were booted off stage. The whole festival was cancelled. Wow. So not just the band, the whole festival was kind of called off. And then this has been running ever since then. So the festival organisers are really cross about this. They said basically the band had signed a contract promising not to do anything that flouted these restrictions, these rules, and what they could do on stage. And then last year, they said the band had to pay them £2 million by 14th of August or face legal action for breach of contract. And here we are now. There's a lawsuit. And they're basically being sued for breach of contract because they'd agreed not to do any of these things on stage. So you couldn't swear, smoke, drink on stage, take off your clothes, talk about politics or religion. You couldn't kiss a member of the audience. There were all these quite strict rules. So it's kind of, I've been thinking about it. I don't know what you think about this, because on the one hand, I think, well, this shouldn't be a thing that gets you in trouble, kissing your bandmate on stage, because we're thinking about who we are. But I guess you could make the argument that the better stance would be to not play that festival if you don't agree with the rules, rather than go along and make your protest, but then get the whole thing called off. I'm really genuinely torn about whether I think it was a noble stance or kind of a dickish thing to do.
It provokes a lot of questions, doesn't it? One, when they agreed, did they sign a contract which was part of this agreement? And did they, the band, know what they were signing? Was it signed by management? Did they realise? It almost sounds like Matt didn't really realise what restrictions maybe there were, but obviously we don't know. That's the big question, isn't it? And then I mean, from the promoters' angle, I guess they are suing because I mean, you'd imagine people have asked for their money back. I don't know what the financial position of the festival would be if they immediately had to shut it down. I don't know.
That's it. It's genuinely, I think it's one of those things where, do you go and make your protest somewhere, or do you just not go? And they went. And I think what's being alleged is that they did sign a contract. In fact, there was a report saying that the band were actually barred from playing because of their kind of stuff in their past. And the authorities in Malaysia were like, no, we don't want them playing here. And there was some kind of an appeal, so the report said there was a promise not to do any of these things. So it's harsh. I mean, I think it's like you say, it all comes down to what did you sign, who was aware of it, when were they aware of it. But it's apparently the festival is coming back this year, which if you're a music fan in Malaysia who went, that's good news if you're a Malaysian pop fan. So the festival hasn't been cancelled forever, but yeah, they're suing the band, and we'll find out kind of, what happens. And we should do our usual line here, shouldn't we? That this may probably get settled rather than go to court. But we'll see.
Here's another big figure. Live Nation made more than $6 billion in revenue in the second quarter of the year. That is a very impressive figure. That's globally? Is it the $6 billion figure?
That is, yeah. That's Live Nation's. It's from the concerts they promote. It's from the ticketing business, because they own Ticketmaster. Everything else they do. So yeah, it's up 7% year on year, which is. Well, I suppose the context really is we've talked about the live music industry and how a lot of bands are struggling, a lot of smaller venues are struggling. And Live Nation obviously covers the whole gamut. They do all the stadium shows, they do arenas, they do kind of amphitheaters, which I think is kind of indoor venues, but it makes me think of Roman Greek style things. But I think amphitheaters in the US is sort of your 2,500 capacity kind of venues.
Right.
So yeah, and 39 million people went to a Live Nation concert in the second quarter of this year. That's up 5%, so more people through the doors. And they picked out international as a big point. So they're selling more tickets in Mexico and Brazil and Peru. And they were saying that, like, in the top 50 tours for international artists and non-US artists, they've been getting 50% more fans than 5 years ago.
Really?
So Afrobeats and Latin artists and K-pop artists. So Live Nation is sort of saying these things, these kind of artists that are big in the streaming world, they're also kind of packing in people at their gigs.
Yeah, because I was going to ask what the driver for these figures are, or which acts have predominantly helped achieve this. But it's an expansion of the market as much as big names being out on tour. Then
it is, yeah. And they were saying stadium concerts are quite slow this year. But it's the arenas and the amphitheaters that are doing really well for them at the moment. And yeah, it is this kind of diversity. It's not just the few big artists. It's these emerging artists from these kind of different parts of the world who can fill an arena, fill a kind of an indoor venue around the US too. What they didn't say much about was they're facing this lawsuit from the Department of Justice in the US that wants to break them up. They didn't really talk about that much. It was kind of like, we're just business as usual. We're dealing with that. We don't agree with them, but they didn't really. That hasn't had an effect on their business because bands aren't not booking tours because they're being sued by the government.
Yeah, just remind everyone of that, because in a way their continued success actually almost plays into the hands of the Department of Justice in the States, who are saying they are too powerful. They have too much of a monopoly over live music. That's the claim, I think.
That's it, yeah, because Live Nation and Ticketmaster merged quite a long time ago now. And yeah, the Department of Justice thinks that they have too much power and they can kind of bully people into not working with competitors, and they can kind of, so that's all in the background here. And yeah, it is like one of the things where the better they do, they're still having to argue we're not a monopoly, we're not too powerful. Either way, we've got $6 billion, which it's a nuanced discussion, isn't it? But in a weird way, I think people look at Live Nation and think they're the biggest company in live. They're a giant. What does that say about grassroots venues? And that there is something to that. But they do book tours and they do book artists who are at that lower end. So these are kind of quite good figures for live music, but it's not the whole picture of the whole industry.
$1 billion of that $6 billion is where they've been selling off their lost property. Just went to they've probably got a big warehouse and just went, let's just flog this off. That'll help.
There's a line in the accounts, pedals, $4 million.
AI music services Suno and Udio have been outlining how they're planning to defend themselves in their lawsuit with labels. We mentioned this before, but you should probably just reiterate the trouble that they've got themselves into, or the dispute which they have become part of, these AI companies.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of companies that are basically AI music services. So you can go on there, you can type in a text prompt, like make me a song about cats in the style of a jazz artist. This is what I do anyway, make a song about cats in different genres. And Suno and Udio are the two with the most momentum. Suno raised a lot of money. They got a lot of press coverage. They're kind of the two biggest new AI music services. And yeah, the three major record labels sued them, accusing them of massive copyright infringement. saying they trained their eyes on labels' music without any licensing deals or permission asked.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so what happened last week was that Suno and Dio, they filed their legal defense in this case. And kind of as we predicted when it was first announced, it's what's called a fair use defense. What they're saying is we can use copyrighted stuff because our system is producing new and original things that don't compete with that music. So it's perfectly fair game. We don't need to sign licensing deals. That's essentially their argument. And that's a very specific legal concept in the US, fair use. Can you do stuff with copyrighted material without a license if it keeps to certain things? So it's quite illegal. But Suno's CEO, who's a guy called Michael Schulman, he's written a couple of really punchy blog posts since these lawsuits were filed. And that's kind of quite interesting because he wrote this blog post saying, yep, the lawsuit's fundamentally flawed. They chose litigation over innovation. He wants to sort of set Suno in this line of things that labels fought that later people thought, oh, it wasn't so bad after all. That's kind of his argument. But he also wrote, and this is kind of quite bullshit, he said, we train our models on medium and high quality music we can find on the open internet. Much of the open internet indeed contains copyrighted materials, and some of it is owned by major labels. So he basically said, yep, we trained on major label music, which the record labels are going, ha, gotcha. But he clearly feels like it's not a gotcha because he's saying it openly in a blog post, which presumably his lawyers would have read.
I mean, the thing is, I don't know about you, but it strikes me that the prevailing attitude among a lot of AI companies is incredibly bullish, don't you think?
Yeah, and their investors too. They're all like, this is perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. It's weird, for me. So I was trying to separate it off. There's like two things here, I think. One is the legal question, like, is this copyright infringement? There's no law saying you can't train an AI on copyrighted music. There's no one's written that law yet. So these lawsuits are going under existing laws, which are kind of like about if you copy music from one place to another without permission, that's infringement. So it's very much about the mechanics of how they're doing it, because there is no law yet saying whether you can or can't train an AI on music without permission. So that's what the music industry wants. But there's kind of the moral, ethical side, which doesn't count for much in business often. But I sort of think if you're a company making a system that can make music and you're training it on all this work of brilliant artists, and you're not thinking, well, we should be paying them some of the money we hope to make, I don't think you're a good egg. I mean, I don't think, like, regardless of whether you can or can't do it, I think if what you're saying is we love music, because they all say we love music, we love musicians, you want to be a tool for you musicians. But if you're not trying to pay the people who are the shoulders you're standing on for your thing, I sort of think it does mark out what kind of company you are, because there are AI companies who are doing it the right way. And the problem they're having is that the music industry isn't quite ready to license them all the music. And so they're not as good as these ones that have just taken it all anyway. So
Is the argument, though, if they are saying that they're coming up with the software which produces music which isn't in competition with the major artists that they've trained their AI software on, then is their argument, well, we're not taking any money away, we're just adding something to the general, landscape of music that's out there, but they're not, the artists themselves, they're not suffering. We're not taking their profits away from them. So what's their problem? Because we're not harming them. I mean, what are they making all this fuss about? Is that part of the argument?
And that's one of the the kind of planks of this fair use idea is your thing commercially competing with the stuff you have used, the stuff you've copied. And no one really knows. Like, it's very early. Like, at the moment, I made some songs in Udio, and you listened to them and gave me a blunt verdict. And we both agreed, I think, they're not going to compete with the best human music.
Yeah.
Now, but in the future, who knows? So that's the one problem. We don't know. Like, we don't know in the future what these things will do. I mean, the interesting thing I found in this blog post by the CEO of Suno was he said that when the lawsuit was filed, Suno was, and I'm quoting this, having productive discussions with a number of the RIA, which is the label's body, major label members to find ways of expanding the pie together. So that Suno were actually talking to labels about what kind of deals can we do, which, I mean, on the one hand, it's fair to say those talks didn't go very well if they turn around and sue them. But it does sort of hold out this idea of maybe there is a deal to be done. Like, they were in talks. He reckons those talks were productive. Maybe there is a path to this to figuring out how this works. So that was a little thing I read and took out of it. Maybe this isn't going to become an awful legal fight. Maybe they will find a way to work together after all. And maybe this lawsuit was a thing that's, will bring them to the table with terms more to the label's liking. Who knows? But,
you are forever the optimist of that.
I know. Well, if you're not an optimist, you just sit and cry about the state of everything, don't you? You have to be optimistic.
The biggest player in K-pop has set out its global ambitions. This sounds like a Bond villain. Tell us who the biggest player in K-pop is and what these global ambitions entail.
Yeah, so this is Hybe, or Hybe. They're a music company in South Korea who are best known for they have their band BTS, so the biggest K-pop band. Who've been on hiatus because they're doing military service, which is one of those quirks of South Korea, where even if you're in the biggest kind of K-pop band in the world, you still have to go and do your military service. And they've got other groups, TXT and Enhypen and Le Seraphim and 17 and New Jeans, some of which people would have noticed because they're playing tours in the UK, playing Glastonbury. So this is very much the preeminent company in the K-pop world. And they've got a new boss and announced a strategy called Hybe 2.0, which is kind of their expansion plans, which involves setting up a new label services business in the US and Latin America, and they're going to be signing artists there. So continuing this expansion beyond Korea, but it's not just about bringing K-pop artists to the world. It's also they want to sign artists around the world and become a global music company. And they're also having a big push with something called Weverse, which is another tech name to fling at you in this podcast.
Right.
So Weverse is like a social media app for musicians to have their profiles and fans to follow them. It's like a super fans app. And it's got like 9 million active users. It's mostly K-pop artists, but Ariana Grande just joined it. So they're signing up artists from the West for that. And they want to make a big push on that and have our super fans app is going to have loads of artists on it in the West. So that's kind of the trend. It's this company that is huge in its homeland and its artists are increasingly popular around the world. But they're saying, right, we want to be a global music company now. We're not just a K-pop band. We're not just kind of a South Korean label. Mm-hmm. We are going to be, and the interesting thing for me was they're really keen on Latin America, and that's one of those trends that I'm sort of seeing, which is that, like in the old days, if you were a non-English speaking part of the world in music, you probably wanted to go and collaborate with British artists or American artists to kind of break through. Mm. Like you had to have someone Anglo. Whereas now you're seeing K-pop companies and artists going to Latin America and going, hey, you're doing really well. We're doing really well. Why don't we make some stuff together? So it's like that cutting out the US or UK middleman and these parts of the world that are quite exciting for the industry, kind of collaborating, opening offices in different places of the world. It's interesting. Although maybe worrying if you're the traditional American and British music industry, you're seeing these global musics come up. And then they're cutting you out and saying, actually, well, maybe a K-pop reggaeton crossover is the next big thing. Mm. We don't need to have an English artist in the middle of it.
It suggests quite a shift. Then there is actually there's quite an important angle to this story. Then that this, and again, following on from where Live Nation are seeing expansion, it's not in the traditional markets.
That's it, yeah. And you're sort of seeing. You're seeing some partnerships too, like Hybe have worked with Geffen Records on one of their artists. Is it Hybe or was it? They're kind of, so that the big Western companies are going, yeah, we should work with you too. But yeah, these companies are really ambitious, and they're ambitious to be known beyond just they're the BTS company. They want to kind of sign and break new artists. So yeah, it's an interesting time.
Back home, the UK music industry's streaming transparency code has now come into being. And tell us more about this.
Yeah, so this is one of the big complaints about streaming throughout the last decade. It's not transparent. So artists don't really understand how their royalties are being paid out. Labels' contracts aren't necessarily always very clear to artists. There's all kinds of bits along the way where you can lose track of what you're being paid and how. So if you remember, we had this big investigation into streaming economics in Parliament a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And then we had some working groups where the music industry basically sat down and shouted at one another to kind of sort out their arguments. That's kind of, I haven't been in the room, but I'm imagining that's how it worked. It was sat down and shouted. But this is part of the outcome. So it's a voluntary code of good practice on transparency in music streaming. Mm-hmm. The good thing there is it's backed by, the labels are backing it, streaming services are backing it. and the bodies that represent musicians and producers and managers, they're all behind this. So essentially everyone is saying this is a good thing and we support it, which is quite unusual in recent times. And it's basically a code of conduct. So it's like stuff like labels making sure musicians really understand their contracts, helping them, making sure they get checked by a lawyer before, making sure that streaming services provide regular, accurate reporting on what's being played and how it's being paid for, giving musicians the ability to kind of audit their royalties and get an auditor in to check they're being paid what they should. So it's all kinds of little good things to make everyone know what's going on and how it's working. The key word being voluntary. So it's not like a binding thing everyone has to do. It's a voluntary thing.
Right.
And there are going to be meetings every 6 months to discuss how it's going, and then a formal review in 2 years' time where they'll sit down and go, right, has everyone been complying with this? And that's where maybe if they're not. And it came alongside. So it's Chris Bryant is a new culture secretary, isn't he? New government. And this came out the same day or just before. He said, we're really keen to get music streaming sorted out and make sure artists are treated fairly. So the new government seems very keen to be sort of standing behind this and going, right, here's your voluntary code. But if you don't stick to it, if you don't make good on those promises, we might step in. So there's kind of it's kind of got some teeth in the background, even though if you don't comply with it, nothing will happen to you straight away. But it's good, I think. I mean, it's just very simple things like, do you understand your contract? And the label having to sort of make sure you do and say, have you got a lawyer? I think there's some bits about labels helping artists with costs of auditing and getting lawyers as well. Like just small things, but they're all good steps forward, I think.
And finally, this actually this follows on from something we were discussing last week when we mentioned radio and how British radio was faring at the moment. And I said, I think it's quite buoyant. It's doing all right. And it turns out, fortunately, what a Burke I'd have looked if I'd got that wrong. It turns out, yes, British radio is doing pretty well. In fact, new stats show that radio listening is at a 20-year high in the UK.
Yeah, so against all those kind of easy assumptions. So this is like a report from Ofcom, the communications regulator, and they have this thing called Media Nations, which comes out every year, and it surveys people on their media habits, including music. So what are you listening to? Where are you listening to it? How? And yeah, so there's kind of two numbers that I want to talk about. So the first is listeners, and that's what's the high. So the number of radio listeners is a 20-year high, just under 50 million people. And I think, what's our population? 67 million or something? It's a big percentage. So the number of people listening is growing. But the caveat is when you measure all the time we spend listening to audio of all kinds. So that is radio, it's podcasts, it's music streaming services. Radio's share of time has fallen from 72% 5 years ago to 61% now. But it's still 61% of our time. And streaming music has grown from 13% to 22%. So in terms of time, radio is falling, but in terms of listens, it's growing. But it's pretty rude health.
I mean, what's amazing about this is radio did very well during lockdown, during the pandemic. So to reach a 20-year high post-lockdown, particularly after you imagine people's lives would change and they would be less reliant on the radio. When radio was a friend, I mean, a lot of people talk to us about, how they interacted with radio while being stuck at home. And obviously everything's moved on a tad now. So this was interesting that radio's all about trends. The other thing which happened last week was there's someone beeping a horn at us. Oh, it's not
if you love radio.
If you like radio. The other thing which happened last week was the quarterly RAJAR figures came out. And RAJAR is the measure of the amount of listeners that all the different radio stations have got. And that was pretty positive once again. And you saw, 5 Live have done well. Radio 2's done okay. Vernon K has still got the biggest national daily radio show, and even Radio 1, which has, for quite some time now, there's been a downward trend at Radio 1. But Radio 1's figures went up in the last quarter. So, radio is quite, as I say, it's quite buoyant. And it is about trends, because it's not, I think you can have one or two bad radars. So networks' figures could go down for a month, maybe 2 months. And that's not a disaster. It's mainly about the overlying trend across a year, which is why they give the figures quarter on quarter and year on year, because really radio stations want to know, well, how are we doing as compared to this time last year? And again, it seems quite buoyant in a lot of cases, and the commercial sector's doing very well too, it seems. There are stations will go up and go down, but in general, people still have a real relationship with radio, I think.
I think about my life, like I'm on this show really as the person who knows all about music streaming and so on, but I have radio in the kitchen. That's on whenever I'm in the kitchen. I have radio in the car. And in both cases, I could be streaming my own playlists on the streaming service. But yeah, it's pretty obvious, because for me, it's like I like someone I like a real person talking to me. I like the sense of community as well. And I feel like a lot of the shows I listen to now are doing more of the people texting in, interaction with people, like, we're all listening together. I guess it was always there in the past, but maybe we just have so many ways to do it now. But I like that idea of being part of a bunch of people listening to the same person at once, which is you don't get that with streaming. It's not its native thing, is it?
And it's strange how radio's retained that while TV hasn't so much, that we don't all sit around and watch the same TV program at the same time. But there is something about listening to, I don't know, it's the spontaneity of radio that captures life in the moment, which is its part of its strength, I think. But there are, this came up last week. If you missed last week's program, we were talking about in Canada, where the streaming services are trying to fight off what would you call it? A levy from the government, who are trying to impose a 3% levy on them to support local music. And they're saying, oh, you're just using this to support your Indigenous radio stations, as if the radio stations were collapsing. And we're saying, I don't know what it's like in Canada, but here, as you say, people mix and match, I think, and radio seems to be holding up very well, despite the fact that streaming puts all music at your disposal, and so you don't necessarily have to wait to see what a DJ plays. You can just play it yourself. But no, the other thing, actually, something attractive about it.
Yeah. The other thing from this Ofcom survey was, people will say, people sort of say we talk about Spotify a lot on this show. They had some stats on streaming services. So 61% of weekly audio listeners in the UK use Spotify. 48% use YouTube. Obviously, you can use more than one. More than 100%. 29% use Amazon Music. 18% use BBC Sounds, and 15% use Apple Music. So that's kind of the rankings in terms of the biggest. So Spotify is, Spotify and YouTube are quite far ahead of the crowd, really. Which
That's
is
interesting. Will Apple be disappointed in that? There's a streaming service that have also tried to do radio. Weirdly,
it's true. The caveat there is Spotify and YouTube have free versions, and Amazon Music, Apple Music don't. But we talked the other day, didn't we, about Universal Music kind of strongly implying that Apple and Amazon weren't growing as fast as they wanted to in subscriptions, and Spotify and YouTube are doing quite well. But no, it's good. I think it's I don't know. It's just there's always a tendency, isn't there, in especially in tech, to say this new thing will kill the old thing, stone dead straight away, and it never does. These things always coexist, and I think this report gets that across, that the kind of things are shifting. And they had they did break out 15 to 34-year-olds, and streaming is now 45% of their listening time, and radio 34%. So you are seeing that. If you assume that younger people maybe have different things, that you are seeing a bit of that. But it's all coexisting. People want to have radio sometimes, streaming other times, and nothing's going to win, I don't think, for a long time yet.
Well, thank you very much for putting Video Killed the Radio Star by Buggles in my head for the rest of the day. And on that bombshell, that's where we'll leave it. Thank you very much for listening once again. If you have enjoyed the show, please do subscribe in your podcast app and give us a review and a rating. If you haven't done so already, it really does help with spreading the word. If you have a question which you'd like us to attempt to answer on the programme, email us at thepriceofmusicpodcast@gmail.com. And finally, if you'd like to support the show with some loose change, you can become a Price of Music fan or super fan for as little as £2 a month. Just go to patreon.com/thepriceofmusic to find out more. Thank you very much, everybody. See you next week.